Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking again with Gayatri, who's a spiritual educator, writer, speaker, and a Brahma Kumaris representative of the United Nations, and Maureen, who was also a Brahma Kumari and has been so for some 30 years in Asia. She's now back in Australia and is involved in a project called The Future of Power. As we closed last week, Gayatri, you were outlining the 7 basic principles that sit behind the Brahma Kumari movement. Would you mind reiterating those?
Yeah, sure. The Brahma Kumaris teachings are actually foundational to what we learn here and what we practice here. And so the first principle lies in our first lesson, which is the principle of knowing the self. The second principle is knowing God and relating to God as an incorporeal being, a supreme being. The third principle is about relationships. My relationship with the Supreme Being and my relationship with others, and of course my relationship with myself. The fourth is understanding the principle of action. Some would call it the philosophy of karma, which would involve knowing how an action is done and what are the consequences of those actions, and what are the accountabilities that are connected to the consequences. And then we have the principle of time.
Yes.
We see time as cyclical, and so it's a cycle of time. This world is a drama stage, and we are all actors. Then we have the principle of humanity being a world genealogical tree, and there's one seed to the tree. And so that principle of unity, when you come back to the seed of the tree. And then we have the principles of what is innate within the human beings, every human being, as we call them, the spiritual rights.
Yes.
And so within every human soul, there are virtues, which would be virtues like peace and love and joy and purity and truth. And also, when we manifest those in the way we operate in the world, we have what is called powers, like the power to cooperate, the power to tolerate, the power to face, the power to accommodate. So there are powers as well. So a spiritual way of living would be the combination, the principle of combining your virtues with your powers. Finally, it's the power of truth. And according to traditions, the power of truth is always oral. And so that final principle, when we are exploring truth and wisdom, we also bring to the attention how the knowledge gets transmitted orally, and then we introduce the whole concept of the revealed knowledge of the Brahma Kumaris.
Thank you for that. That's and it's clear that surrounding that power of the remembering are these principles. It's a core essence. You mentioned power a couple of times. Maureen, you're involved in a thing called the Future of Power. That sounds pretty fascinating. Can you give us an idea of the thrust of that?
Yeah, actually it was initiated by a person called Nizar Juma, who's based in Africa. And he's kind of like the right hand of the Aga Khan, so from a Muslim background.
Okay.
And he was chairman of 6 companies, but had a lot of stress and He said his ego was bigger than Africa, which creates a lot of that stress and
Yes,
anger.
that's right.
And from taking up this practice of kind of reflection and meditation, he found that when he could manage himself, then of course he could manage a lot more in the world as well. So from having 6 companies and so much stress,
Yes.
he has now built up to being the chairman of 54 companies,
Okay, that's obviously
many
worked.
of them publicly listed. And he says, I have really no stress and very little anger.
Right.
So he actually wanted to bring that experience to, you know, others, like what he was benefiting from. And within the Brahma Kumaris, we have 20 what we call wings, like departments.
Right.
So we have educators, jurists, agriculturalists, medical people who are all trying to benefit people within their own profession from what they have developed. And I guess after 80 years of being an organization, we've developed a big toolbox of you know, courses and values-based materials. Like we work in prisons, we work in farms with the farmers, we're working in the schools and all these different areas. So he partnered with the Brahma Kumaris to do this project called The Future of Power. And I've been actually living in India for the 4 years doing this project. And this is focused on India because what we're seeing is an emergence of power in India. Of course, economically, predominantly, but with power comes responsibility. So we're kind of going around and bringing leaders together into a dialogue in different cities. So I've been in 32 cities in India,
heavens,
bringing
yes.
30 to 40 top leaders from all the different fields together to dialogue about power. So the question is, what kind of power? We're specifically focused there on India, but we could focus anywhere. But what kind of power India will bring? Is it going to be the same thing, guns, money, or can India draw on its ancient tradition of values, culture, spirituality, and the power of the mind, which I was mentioning before,
Yes.
and really use a very different model in, you know, shaping power for the future?
Yes.
So really changing the face of power to make it more benevolent. In fact, a lot of people say, why do you call it power? That's so negative. And I say, well, power's not negative. The way we're using
What
it
we
is.
do with it, yes. And trying to constrain ourselves within containers called time is also pretty stressful. We're out of it for the moment. We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Allah, Alleluia, Mani Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Gayatri and Maureen, both of whom are Brahma Kumaris, and we're basically talking about power. Gayatri, there's a process that you're involved in, I believe, which is called the call of the times, and that's to do with power. How does that work?
The call of the time has nothing to do with power.
Well, I got that wrong then, didn't I?
You did, because I'm one of those strong believers that power is negative.
Yes, okay.
I was involved with the call of the time since 1999. And the Daddy Janki, or chief of the Brahma Kumaris, called together a group of people from around the United Nations. And she asked them the question, how can we be of service to you? And their answer was quite surprising. At the time I heard it, not so surprising today. And they said to her that they were interested in a domain that they felt a real transformation happened in. It's a little bit like Einstein saying the domain that problems were created is not the same domain the solutions would be found. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yes, yes.
And so they wanted to explore that spiritual domain in which solutions could emerge from. And so the call of the time is actually set within the context that in the domain of silence, Silence, not an absence of something, but silence the presence of something. That solutions and answers could emerge from. And so it's a dialogue that we hold around the world, in different parts of the world. And the dialogue is really bringing together people who are personally practitioners of different spiritual disciplines, but they have a commitment to their personal practice. And then they integrate that into the work that they do. So they're working with the double helix of the spiritual with the secular.
Yes.
And the benefit of these dialogues is that when someone embarks upon the world stage, coming from personal spirituality and integrating that into the work they do, they can really feel lonely. And sometimes very much alone, because it's as though they're swimming against the tide.
Yes.
And so when they come together with people who are doing similar things, this network becomes a network of great benefit to them. They know that they could call on someone from the other side of the world and say, I'm going through this, could you help me think it through? Knowing that they wouldn't just come from the secular perspective or the secular world, but they know that there are certain elements that they're working on the inside of themselves that they could bring to make a difference in the work that they do. So that's what the Call of the Time dialogue is all about. But the question, I think, that is very, very significant is to ask them when they come in for their check-in, you know, when you sit together and you do that check-in, what is the call of the time for you? And it's always a very moving question.
Right.
What is the call of the time for me?
That's amazing. And so the silence that you were talking about, were you referring to remembering? Were you referring to people in remembering space collectively or individually? Or?
Beautiful question. You always would go into silence, of course, stepping into the self. So it's a personal choice.
Yes.
Silence is a choice. You know, you step into this space of silence. But when you're doing it together, it becomes a space of collective silence. And what is beautiful, they would literally spend about 6 hours in this collective silence. And what emerges is a collective wisdom. Because when they talk about what came out of the silence, you could see it weaving this beautiful tapestry. And the beautiful tapestry is a collective wisdom. And so that in itself is very unifying for them and brings them very close.
Yes, it's powerful. It's oftentimes when you come out of having had some experience, and that you come out of it, there's a palpable presence. You can almost cut it with a knife. And so what you're actually turning that into outcomes. That's a worldwide movement.
Yes, it is a worldwide movement, and it is intended to help people understand this paradigm, that there is a paradigm shift, and it is all about the inside out rather than the outside in. Yes. And so more people are beginning to look for strength. You know, it's not I'm against the word power, but I think what I like more is the word strength. And so it is more meaning making for them, it's more strength generating for them, but it's coming from a space that goes beyond the selfish motives.
Yes.
And I think maybe that's why power for me is always connected to something selfish, whereas strength is connecting more to generate something for me that could be of benefit to others.
Is that the core thing that you do as a Brahma Kumari in the United Nations? Is that what you're doing there, or do you do other things?
Well, it got stimulated from people within the UN, the Call of the Time. But what I do at the United Nations is that we have what is called a consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. And we're supposed to bring an expertise of the work and the teachings of the Brahma Kumaris to help the United Nations with the work, their policies and their action plans, and etc., and bring it back to the people. And within that, we had to really distinctly tell the United Nations what is the expertise we're bringing to their programs.
Yes.
And our expertise that we bring to the United Nations is a spiritual trajectory of awareness, attitude, vision, action, which is a neutral trajectory.
Yes.
But it is very important that before the United Nations, we were to say to the United Nations, okay, I'd like to take up the issue of environment. When we take that issue of environment up and bring it to the people so that they could know what's going on,
yes.
we bring it with that spiritual thrust of what's the awareness I should have in my relationship with the environment, what's my attitude toward it, what is my perception, and then what's my action.
And the action at the present moment is to go to a break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Gayatri and Maureen, Brahma Kumaris. Now, Maureen, Gayatri sort of challenged you on power. Tell us a bit more about power.
Well, I guess being involved in this particular topic for so long, and I've met over 1,000 leaders all over India, and I think there can be another way that power is used, but probably to sum it all up in just one quote that I heard from someone, he said that we never thought of ourselves in the past as powerful. Okay. And we meaning, I guess it was Indian, but I think he means from his tradition, we never thought of ourselves as powerful, but empowered.
Right.
And when we think we are powerful, we destroy everything.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think this is what it's all about, that as much as we can get out of our own way, get out of God's way, there's a lot that can be done if we let the divine work through us. And this is what I think a lot of this is to do with. I mean, I know myself, I took up something we were talking a little bit before about the Tao, and there was a sentence that said, few leaders realize how little they have to do. And the less I do,
yes.
the more effective.
Yes.
So I think to look at power in a very different way is to explore some of these ideas. What is real power? It's nothing to do with the power we see out there in the world nowadays. So
no,
I have a
I
little
think
bit
peace
different.
has been made. Now, this communication is a massive issue, and you're just talking about the way in which probably the media use the concept of power, which actually causes people to associate it with something that may be negatively loaded. IVOH, what's that about? That sounds pretty fascinating when you described it before.
Images and Voices of Hope actually came into being about maybe 15 years ago. And it actually started with a group of people from the media who were looking at the impact of images and messages that were being exported from the United States to other parts of the world, and the impact that was having on meaning making in the world.
Yes.
And how much it was impacting particularly the younger generation, and molding and shaping their intellects in understanding the United States and understanding their own countries. And so they decided that they would create an organization that was called Images and Voices of Hope, to show the other side of the United States and the images that they would export to bring hope into people's lives. And it started as media as an agent for world benefit. You know, the media in many parts of the world think that they're neutral. They tell you the news as it is, but they don't advocate something. They don't try to bring benefit. Here it is, you take it. It's your choice how you want to use it. But I think ever since, within the last 15 years of Images and Voices of Hope, we have noticed that more and more people are beginning to think differently about what news is and the impact of news on people whose lives, because you're sitting in your living room, you put on your television, and there is the news. It's not that you could filter it out as such. And it has grown over the years, but I think this year, in 2014, we actually hit a nerve that I think is very, very important. And that is, we have come to the point in which collectively, with media makers from around the world, and by media makers we mean people who are journalists, people who are documentary filmmakers, people who are artists, people who are in the advertising arenas, they all come together and they coin this term restorative narrative. Restorative narrative is an approach to covering a story. And so in covering the story, the journalists would then look at different factors. And so the principles behind the covering of the stories, or the factors to be considered, would be recovering. What is being recovered? The recovery process. What is being revitalized? What is being restored? And so within those three principles, then you see that the journalist is not just telling you if it bleeds, it leads. But the journalist is saying, look, there is a community that's in recovery. And what the community is building here is resilience. And so within that resilience building, we have to be patient with the community. We may cover it that this event happened, but we have to have a sustaining kind of approach that would show the recovery process that is taking place within the community. So that requires from the person covering the story to be a little bit more attentive to this process that is restorative, so that people can then see that there is hope even if there was a disaster. And so they are going into the direction of the hope rather than becoming victims of the disaster and staying as victims of that disaster. So in essence, that's what restorative narrative is.
And in essence, it fits in very much with what the Brahma Kumaris are about, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
It's bringing because as you say, there's that shock, that little square electronic box is throwing these huge images out of you, very destructive. And this brings in the potential for the future, what's really going to happen. It's a bit like remembering, isn't it? It's a bit like remembering. I'm a bit stuck on that. It's been fantastic just to talk through what the Brahma Kumari movement itself is about, where it comes from, and what you're actually doing. And in the United Nations, the impact of having that in the United Nations is just amazing. And the power issue, whether we call it power or not, is another one. And teaching people the capacity to remember. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back next week. Bye for now. Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu